Yeah, she was in Mount Bird when I walked in here going around that little. Oh, there she goes.
Okey-dokey.
Late now, I'm gonna give you Independence Day. Just send you home, don't even worry about that. Just send you home.
I got a couple more that might be late. She gets carte blanche. We've had meetings at our factory.
I know, and that was totally awesome.
What did you have at your factory?
I didn't have a factory meeting, how about that one?
That's even better. We had blood pathogens.
And suicide prevention.
And suicide prevention and mental health.
There you go, and how to call the hotline.
Well, that might be for us, the mental health piece might be for the adults.
It was, it was.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
I think Dorendo had another meeting going on, she'll be a few minutes late, and I think Dave's still on the letter, so we probably got about everybody we're gonna have. So as I mentioned last couple meetings, we're looking forward to having Mr. Ward here with us, our Assistant Superintendent of Business Services. I'll have to quit referring to him as the CFO, because he has a title now. But we've asked Scott to come and just give us an overview as we're reaching the close of our budget season and all the number crunching that's been going on for the past several months. So I feel like it's important that everyone on both teams has a really good overview of the challenges that we're facing. Also, just want to mention that Mr. Ward's also been out in the community, pretty much anywhere that'll have him, doing varied versions, tailored versions of his presentation to different community groups, whether it be civic organizations, municipalities, the county, pretty much anybody that'll listen to him. So, and to the benefit and plight of all educators here in the district. So, if you have not had a chance to meet him, this is Mr. Scott Ward, and I'll let him take over with his presentation.
Thank you. I will try to make this as quick as possible, so if I'm going too fast, please stop me. I know it's been a long day for you guys, and you're already probably getting home like everybody else. This is, like Chad said, this is a thing that Superintendent asked me to do basically for the community. I've been out a couple of times in the community. It was late last year, so during the summertime there really wasn't a lot of interest. But I've spoke to principals, and I will do it for any PTO, I'll do it for anybody, basically anybody who will listen to me. I'll be happy to go and spend some time with them, because I think it's very important to truly understand the issues that we are all facing in Florida. Whether you're a parent, or whether you're an employee, or a teacher, or an administrator, we all have the same issue. And that's funding education in Florida. So this is the same presentation I do. It has been modified several times as new information comes up. I do change the information, and it depends also on the people that I'm speaking to. If I'm speaking to a group that's more business community, I've got more of the business topics that go in there. If I'm speaking more to the parents and the schools and the educators, a little bit less of the business side and more of the funding side. So today we'll go over state spending in education, operating funds for K-12 schools, Lake County schools, 1920 budget highlights, capital outlay funds for K-12 schools, and the Florida lottery. Let me just start by saying the state spending on education and operating funds for K-12 are two different issues. A lot of times when legislators in the state talk about spending on education, you have to remember it's not just K-12 that they're talking about, it's several other areas too, such as universities and colleges. So what does state spending look like? I started in this business in 2004. I was hired as a CFO in the Alachua County School District. Prior to that, I had 8 years working with the state government as an auditor for the Auditor General's office. I audited primarily education entities, so it was just a fit for me to go into CFO at a district. Back in 2003, I go back to that number because around 2003, they changed the governmental reporting model. So when you go back and you look prior to 2003, it doesn't look good comparing numbers to what you have today. But if you look at state expenditures in 2003 by category, they're very similar to what they are today, categoricalized. So you got criminal justice, natural resources, transportation, state courts, general government, education, and human services. If you look at the first graph of 2003, you will see that education and human services are about 50-50 in their funding percentages, about a third of the state spending. What you'll see in 2018 is you will see that human services has grown significantly in its funding portion. However, education has shrunk in this percentage. Although education spending has increased, it has not increased as fast as human services. And a lot of that has to do with the federal government, the federal mandate that states have to match Medicare and Medicaid funding. And because of that mandate, and because our legislators truly believe that they need to cut taxes in Florida constantly, the push has been cutting or not funding education at the level that it was funded years ago. A different way to look at that is this graphic here. So each year listed across the state spending for education. And the red at the bottom is education, the orange is all other of those categories, and the red line you see is the percentage of those two with each other. So you can see in 2003, about 33% of funding was allocated for or spent on education. However, in 2018, that has dropped down to about 26.5%, 27%. So we've talked about education spending across the board, but that's not what we're really here for today. We're here, we depend solely or mainly on operating funding for K-12 schools. So we all have heard the term Florida Education Funding Program funding. A couple of interesting tidbits about that historically is this was developed in the early 70s, and it came off of a governor's committee of legislators, educators, and business community members who came together to try to address the state needs. It's a very interesting report. I got a copy of it if you ever want to email me, I'd be happy to send it to you. But one of the things that they wanted to do is they wanted to design the primary mechanism of funding education for each county. Because obviously in 1970, much like today, funding in Columbia County, where I come from, is much different than Miami-Dade. There's a lot higher revenue source for Miami-Dade because of their taxing of their home values. So just real quick, the formula recognizes varying local property taxes, varying education program costs, varying cost of living, and varying cost of equivalent education programs due to sparsity and dispersion and of the student population. The FEFP formula is not an easy formula. There are parts of it that I still struggle with trying to understand. But the intent of the FEFP is to make it consistent, so based on the need and based on the ability to pay by county, it kind of equates that out. Now, I will say it's not equal, but they do work at it. So what does it look like for the for Lake County schools? This is the second calculation for 2020, and this is our FEFP that we get funded. Now, please remember, that funding, even though it is set by the state, that funding includes both local and state funding, okay? So when we talk about the BSA, a portion of the BSA comes from the state, a portion of the BSA comes from your local funding, which is your taxes. But the mechanism controls all of that through the FEFP formula. So the base funding is $201 million, and it is unrestricted. Now the term restricted and unrestricted, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with because we've been in education for a while, the legislators will appropriate funding to the counties, and when they do so, a lot of times they will restrict the purpose of that funding. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But you'll see the next item is the best and brightest this year, which we all know as educators, was formerly done outside of the FEFP formula. It was a grant, and it was distributed to the districts, but it was distributed based on the information that the Department of Education gave us, and the idea was we were going to flow that straight to the teachers, and that was it. So it's restricted, and even now it's been rephrased and moved into the FEFP formula. It's still restricted for teacher and principal bonuses. 0.748 mil compression, because our tax values are lower than the state average, the state kicks in some extra funding to cover that discretionary millage, and it's $6.4 million. A lot of times people say, well, it's discretionary millage. Why don't you cut it out? Why don't you reduce it? First off, all 67 school districts levy the full discretionary millage. Second, if you cut that out in our district, not only would you lose the local tax dollars, you would lose the $6.4 million also. School safety, restricted to school safety, $2.6 million this year. When we budget for all of the SROs and the guardians, it's over $4 million. So here they restricted the funding, but the legislation requirements that we have to meet are more than what the funding is. So not only did they restrict the funding that they gave us, but they caused a restriction of our other funding too. So that's an important thing for everybody to understand. ESC guaranteed allocation, the thing about the ESC guaranteed allocation is since the inception of the ESC guaranteed allocation, they have only adjusted that number for growth. So they take the same number or the same dollars per student, and then as the district has an increase in those students, they increase for the number of students, but they don't increase, or they haven't increased for a number of years, the cost of educating those students. So that's important to remember. A lot of times when they add money to these categoricals, they'll do a portion for growth, and then they'll do a portion for increasing the cost. Well, we all know that ESC student education is very expensive, and we know for sure that the costs have gone up significantly over the years. So, turnaround supplemental services, that's something that's new this year. It's new to our district. It's $318,000. It's sent to us specifically for our DA schools, which would this year would be Beverly Shores. Instructional materials, $3.6 million. That's about a $200,000 shortfall this year for the funding that we need to cover what we need to do in instructional materials this year. Student transportation, y'all have heard this before, I'm sure. The funding for student transportation, the funding really hasn't increased except for growth or the number of students that you transport. Hasn't increased in a number of years, and it's only being funded at about 50% of what it cost us to transport those students. And remember now, they have statutes that say we have to bus every kid that's not within 2 miles of a school. So we have a mandate that we have to do, but the funding is not enough to cover that mandate. So student transportation, classroom supplies flows right through to the teachers, reading allocation, digital classrooms, all of these are restricted. And then last year we got the total funds compression for 1 year. We got it renewed again this year, but it's only a 1 year. Because of the way that they did the formula, they didn't do it right, according to my opinion. And so it actually got reduced significantly. And then McKay scholarships, I put that in red because when they take McKay scholarships from us, it takes it out of our unrestricted funds. So when they remove the McKay scholarships, it's reducing our unrestricted funding. So I talk about that because a lot of the things that we talk about that are important to us on a day-to-day basis gets funded outside of those restricted pots of money. So a lot of the times the increases that the legislature give us when they're increasing on the restricted side doesn't help us do things like cover the cost of increased electricity or the salaries of our employees or insurance or several other things that happen on an annual basis for us, and we don't have an opportunity to cover that anywhere else except for those unreserved funds or those unrestricted funds. So what does that look like over time? When you compare FEFP components from 2003 to 2020, you will see what's been going on is before in 2003, over 75%, almost 80% of the funding was unrestricted in the BSA, the base student allocation. The FEFP, the other orange part, was partially restricted, the categorical was fully restricted. So with that 2020, you can see that close to 80% has been reduced down significantly. It's probably about 66% now. So you can see the trend has been, although they've been increasing funding in education, the increasing has been more on the restricted side than it has been on the unrestricted side. So we talked about the base student allocation, and that really is, when you talk to finance people that are dealing with schools for a number of years, they will tell you the important thing to watch is the base student allocation, because that's your unrestricted things that you can address your day-to-day operating expenses with. It's not restricted to those other things. I'm sorry, I get talking too fast, faster than my brain can go. But anyway, you can see that 2003, it was a little over 3,500, and 2020, it's a little over 4,200 and 47 or something like that, I think it is this year, what the state average is. But what's happening is, you can see through time, 2008 it was trending up, 2008 after we hit the recession, it trended down, and then 2012 it was recovering, it was doing a pretty good job, they were letting it creep right back up, and then 2016-17 come in, and they started saying, look, they're taxing our local people too much, we want to start taking the required local effort millage, and we want to start backing it back down and lowering the taxes on our residents in the state of Florida. And so when they started doing that, they have flattened out that growth of that BSA. So if you superimpose a line on top of that BSA, you'll see from 2003 to 2020, the overall increase is a 1.12% increase. Okay, that's the percentage increase that we get in state and local funds to cover increasing costs in our district. 1.1%. There's not a lot you can do with that. I mean, I think everybody will agree. There's not a whole lot you can do with 1.1% funding. By the way, I got a copy of the Department of Education submission of the budget for next year. I'm not sure if you did. It's a $50 increase in BSA, which is a 1.117% increase in the BSA. So this trend's not going to change anytime soon. Just want to say that. All right, so, you know, what was the big thing this year? And this is always, you know, makes us shake our heads and cringe. Florida legislature finishes K-12 budget with $248 increase per student. The highlight of the 2019 budget was a $75 per student increase in flexible district spending. They took money from other categoricals and moved it to the BSA and said, hey, it's flexible now. But they really didn't change any of the rules that required you to spend that money. Last year, that increase was 47 cents. We all know the 47-cent increase. It was hideous. They should have just left it at zero. Because it's 47 cents doesn't matter, make that much of a difference. That was printed in Tampa Bay Times headline, April 30th, 2019. That was actually a misprint. It was $243. It wasn't $248. I think they got an earlier version of the release, and it was in error. So what does that mean for Lake County? Well, a lot of people don't understand that $243 is the state average, but different districts actually got different amounts increased. So what did we get? We did get the $75 increase in base student allocation because that is consistent across the state of Florida. We got a $97 of that $243, 97 of that was best and brightest, which was formerly funded outside of FEFP and doesn't do us really any good for the district operations anyway. It's great because we can hand it over to the teachers, but at the same time, it doesn't help us with any of our other expenses because it is restricted. Okay? And then, because of the way that the FEFP formula works in the state of Florida, Lake County schools per student funding only increased $215. Well, that's a big difference over 243. In fact, the last bullet point, that's a 28 difference in the per student funding, which would be an additional $1.3 million in operating revenue for Lake County. So if we really did get what they advertised, we would have had an additional $1.3 million. So this is important. We always talk about where we are, how we rank. We were 57th, now we're 61st. Stuart's probably going to call me out on this, but technically we're tied for 60th. Well, I was deducted from 67. I was going from the bottom up. We're a few steps from Volusia County. So it's really 60, 61, depends on which direction you're coming from. But yeah, good point when you brought that up the other day. What's going on in Lake County? Well, we're the middle child when it comes to education districts. We really are. We're not small. There's a lot of extra money put in small school districts. We're not large. We don't have a large tax base, so we don't have a lot of extra local funding coming in. So what does that mean to us? That means that we're about 61st in funding for the rest of the state of Florida. Other changes to the FEFP formula, these are things that make someone like me go nuts. I've been doing this for a while, and sometimes when legislators and the state comes out and talks about what they've done for education funding, that they really didn't do. Best and brightest, obviously, that's $4.2 million for our district. That's $284 million that they talked about new funding for education. That was not new funding for education, it was just moved. Transportation, in 2010, they redid the transportation, instructional materials, and teacher lead programs. They were all categoricals outside of the general FEFP formula until 2010. They rolled them all in and said, hey, look at the big increase we did. So 8.9 million for our district, 3.6 million instructional materials, $850,000 for teacher leave money that was funded in prior outside and it got moved into the formula. This is my favorite. This one would just drives me crazy. 2011, they needed to increase education funding. They didn't have any funding to do it. So what did they do? They said the formula you use when you budget your local taxes prior to this year was restricted to 95%. You can only budget 95% of your local taxes. And the reason being is because when you pay your taxes, if you pay them earlier, there's a rebate on that. You get a discount. And also not everybody pays their taxes. So the state of Florida actually says you can only budget 95% of your local taxes. So this year they need to show an increase, so what do? They moved it to 96. So we didn't get any more funding in education. No one in the state of Florida did. But we were allowed to show a higher budget number for revenues and expenditures based on that. So what does that mean statewide? That's a $97.9 million addition to state budget for K-12 education that's not real. It's just not real. That's $1 million for our district. That when they talk about today, when they say, if you compared prior to 2011 to today, that's funding in education that wasn't real funding. And that wasn't just moving it from somewhere else. It never existed.
Wow.
So what does that do for a district like ours that sees those long-term trends going on? I pulled numbers from some old records. Don't hold me to them. They're not my records. I've only been here for a year. But in 2003, I found where it was reported that our average teacher salary was $37,652. Guys, I'm not picking on teachers. It's just that's typically what everybody asks for, and it's been documented for a long time. So it's easier for me to pull that information. Average teacher salary in 2018 was reported at $45,455, which is a 1.3% increase average. Okay, no one's proud of it. It's nothing to write home about. It's more than the BSA increase. But again, you start to understand why it cannot be any more than that. It can't get much greater than that because the funding is not there. Then you also look at the Florida retirement contribution. Y'all remember back in the late 1990, when Jeb Bush came in as governor, and they were looking for ways to cut funding in education. And one of his creative ways was, we're going to reduce the FRS contribution that school districts have to make. And that'll help them out in their budgets. And it did. It helped us out in our budgets for a few years. But then they came back along and said, you know what? We're having a deficit in our Florida retirement system. We can't do that anymore. Not only are we going to have to restore it back to the actuarial amount that it requires for each year, but we're going to have to make up that loss that happened for those several years. We're today still paying a rate that's a little bit higher than what's required because we're still making up for that.
Plus we charge teachers 3%.
I'm going to get to that.
But they also invested in Enron, which they lost.
Right. So that's for our retirement system. I always tell the community it's compulsory. We don't have an option. I'm not saying that it's not a good thing to have retirement, but I will say, sometimes people say, well, you spend all your money in retirement. No wonder. Well, guess what? We don't have an option at this level, at the local level, to say we're not going to pay retirement to anybody. If you're an employee of a school district, it's mandatory that you participate in a retirement plan, unless you're appointed superintendent. So health insurance contribution, 7% average increase in health insurance. Sounds high, but knowing some of the changes that have happened in recent federal legislation, like Obamacare, referred to as Obamacare, 7.16% is not that bad when you look at it. It's not nothing to celebrate, but it's not as bad as what some of our smaller districts up north, where like Chad came from, saw some 15% increases in 1 year, and I've heard as high as 22% in others. So 7% over across the board, not a bad deal. Taxes, payroll taxes, we still have to pay payroll taxes. Thank goodness they haven't changed our rates on that, but it blends to that 1.3% that goes along with salaries. So total salary and benefit increase of 1.95%. So it's outpacing the BSA if you look at it over a long period of time. Okay. Energy services, there's about a 5% annual increase in energy services, but a lot of things that have happened in this district since 2003 has been adding additional schools and sites, and when you add additional schools, obviously your expense goes up. Property casualty insurance, there was actually a change in how we were doing that a number of years ago. There was a significant savings in it, and so I just put it up there because property casualty insurance is one of those things that when it goes up, we have to fund that out of the BSA. So I included it there for comparison. So what does Lake County Schools financial condition ratio look like? So the financial condition ratio is set how you calculate it by statute. And if it drops below 3%, I have to pick up the phone, call the Commissioner of Education and say, hey, we're having a financial issue. We got to come up with a plan. Everybody gets involved. It's not pretty. So what you'll see is in 2003, you'll see a slow downward trend from 2006 to 2009. It kind of flattened out. That was when the housing boom was happening, and then crashed 2008, 2009. It took a lag time for the taxes to really show a decrease from that housing boom. 2010, 2011 is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That was one of the few times that I've ever seen that you could actually take and supplant general funds in a federal project. So what we were allowed to do in school districts, we were allowed to take general fund expenditures and separate them out and stick them in a federal project for 2 years. But when that funding left in 2 years, there wasn't any additional funding coming from the state, and that's why in 2012, 2013, you see a sharp drop in our fund balance condition ratio. You see it kind of hold on 2015, start trending down. 2017, 18, and 19, it's going to be a little bit up at the end of this year, but it's hovering just north of 3%. And what we are doing is we are maximizing our transfers from capital that we're legally allowed to keep it above that 3%, because it's not going to be pretty when we call and tell them we dropped below 3%, we got to call the commission and all that. It's not fun. So, operating budget highlights. I think this is important for a lot of people to understand when we start talking about our budget, when we talk about to the community, when we talk about board members and employees. I think it's important to understand some distinctions. Lake County is different than a lot of other counties in that we have some very large charter school numbers here. When you look at our county to other districts of our size, one of the things that you need to remember is when you pay a charter school, it doesn't look like a salary. It's a purchase service. Okay, so if you take salaries at our district on a district-wide level and compare them to a Marion County, which is a very similar size, you would go, oh my goodness, we're look at the size of this district and how much money they're not putting in salaries. Well, that's because a lot of our money is flowing out into charter schools. And when that money flows out, it flows out, pretty much all of it flows out to them. We don't keep anything for administration. How many of y'all have heard several times about the 5% we get to keep? 5%? We get to keep 5% on the first 250. So if it's 500 students, we're really only getting 2.5%. If it's 1,000 students, it's even less. And if they are I forget the term that they use, but if they're a high-performing charter school, we only get to charge them 2%. And if they're 2% of 1,000 students, you get to see it's not even worth deducting half the time. But we still do to maximize it. But I just like to say that because people always say, well, you get 5%. No, you don't. We get, on the average of all of our charter schools, we get about 2%, a little more than 2%. So total appropriations, which is your budgeted expenditures for the upcoming budget. This is based on the tentative budget that we submitted and it was approved not too long with the board. $370.3 million, $51.7 million of that flows directly into the charters. So that's money right out the door. So the other 318 stays in the traditional. It covers our schools, it covers our district, it covers our employees. All of our general operations are in that red part of that little circle. 51 million or 14% goes to charters and 80% stays. Okay, so of the $318.6 million, 253.9 of that is salaries and benefits. So if you did that without deducting the charter schools, it makes it look like we don't spend enough on salaries and benefits, but we really are in line with everybody in the state. About 80% of salary and benefits that gets paid out of our budget each year. Let's get one. Yeah. Okay. So of the 253.9 in salaries and benefits, 208.4 million is at schools, and 45.5 is at departments. So you know how we do budgets, we budget at the school and then we budget at department levels. The school levels, the staffing, the cost for salaries and benefits, is $208.4 million, and the department staffing is $45.5 million. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what's sitting in the schools and what's not in the schools. Of the $45.5 million in salary and benefits for department staff, 31.8 is for school support, such as transportation, maintenance, security, student services, and IT. So a lot of these services are being performed in the schools. They're just at a department level budget. And then $13.7 million is for administrative support of the district, such as curriculum, finance, human resources, facilities, board, and superintendent. So you can see it just kind of whittles down to kind of give you an idea of where the money's going in the district. And then this, I put this up because I think it's good for people to understand, because I get asked constantly, you know, what would a 1% raise cost? What would a 3% raise cost? What would be, you know, what would that cost by employee type? So I broke out the employee types. I put the total amount of salary and benefit costs. Instructional is $166.4 million, exempt 9.1, classified 62.5, professional managerial 8.9, district administration 5.1, and school administration 11.6. So if you want to figure out what a 1% raise is, there's your numbers multiplied by 1%. That gives you an idea. All right, so we've been talking about the operating funds, and that is something that is definitely an issue that we all have to contend with. But it's just as bad when you look at funding on capital outlay. And do we understand capital outlay when I say capital outlay? Capital outlay is your car, operating is when you stop and get the gas. Okay, so you buy the car with your capital funds, but you maintain and you put gas in it with your operating funds. Okay, so capital outlay funds for investment in long-term assets such as lands, buildings, vehicles. Capital outlay funds can only be used for the initial purchase or major renovation of a long-term asset. They cannot be expended on the day-to-day operations of assets. All state capital outlay funds must be expended on building new education facilities, debt service of those facilities, or renovating existing facilities. Local capital outlay millage proceeds can be used to construct or purchase new facilities, renovations, remodel, but also has to be used for the purchase of buses and furniture fixture equipment that goes to our schools. So you got a little bit more, you got a little bit less restriction on local capital funds. Still has to be an asset, something you keep for a long time, but you can buy buses and furniture fixtures, equipment, stuff like that. It doesn't have to be building related, in other words. And this is always important because I always get the question from members and from board members, from community, you know, why did you go out and buy 30 buses? We need to pay our teachers more money. Well, that money was state capital outlay funding, and there's a lot of restrictions on that funding. We have the Auditor General come in here once every 3 years. The Auditor General, who I used to work for, are some of the toughest auditors in the state of Florida. They're very black and white. They don't see any middle of the road. And this is very important. This is one of the few times in statute it actually does this. It does it a few other times. But it says, the misuse of capital funds for operating purposes. It will result in a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the district's FEFP. So if we take $10,000 out this year and use it to pay a teacher, next year they're going to take $10,000 out of our FEFP. So you can't play with the dollars between capital and operational. And that's the reason why when we have capital dollars, we want to spend them on buses. We can't spend them on the day-to-day operation of the district.
A version of this is what got the UFC president.
Correct. That is absolutely correct. So let's talk a little bit about state capital outlay funds. Hopefully through time you've heard about some of these plans or programs. But since my time, since 2004, there's really only been 3 major state capital outlay plans. And that's been the CO and DS service, which has been around for a long time. It's funded by motor vehicle licenses and registration taxes. PICO, which is our public education capital outlay, that's been really one of the bigger programs since I've been here, but it's now gone away for us at the school at K-12 level. It's funded by sales taxes on utilities, telephones. Remember, how many people you have a telephone in your home now? Well, the trend over a number of years has been they were taxing those telephone lines and those telephones at homes, but as everybody was switching to cell phone service, they never would tax the cell phone service, and that tax revenue was going down. It's been going down for a number of years. And then the lottery programs, the famous Florida Lottery that gives us all so much money. They also have a program for capital outlay. Now here's one thing that's important to understand about state capital outlay programs. All of these programs at one time had a bonding capacity function in that if it wasn't enough money in 1 year, you could take the proceeds and you could bond those over 20 years. So you would take the next 20 years revenue and you pledge them on a bond and you go borrow money. And they did that for PICO all the way up until 2012. They did that for every year. So every time a little bit of revenue came in, capacity, they would go out and they would immediately bond that, and they would take a $20 million and turn it into $200 million just by doing that one thing. Well, 2012, they actually, what year was it? Okay, so 2012, they stopped bonding those proceeds. They no longer bond capital outlay debt service proceeds. They haven't bonded those since 2010. And the lottery program, they took all the proceeds that they had, all the available money that they had in 2009, they bonded 100% of it. And since then, all of the lottery proceeds set aside for capital outlay has been for nothing but debt service. So all the money that's been paid since 2009, none of that has been going to schools. It's all being used to pay for debt service. So state hasn't done any new bonding for CO and DS. We still get funded, but it's not enough money to do any major capital outlay issues. And we don't have an opportunity. They've been doing refundings where they take old COPS issues and roll them into new. They're basically like refunding your house or remortgaging your house. They've been doing that, but they haven't done any new issue for new construction since 2010. We haven't gotten any funds allocated for K-12 new construction since 2009 in the PICO program. PICO also funds universities and colleges, and what they've been doing is they've been shifting the focus back on them and away from us. And then the lottery programs, as I said, we haven't had any new construction funds from them since 2009. All of their money is being put on debt. So we talked about state programs. Let's look at our local capital outlay funds. Local capital outlay millages, 2010. Don't know why, we're having a poor economy, but our legislators decided that we were allowed to levy 2 mills for capital outlay purposes. They decided that from now on, you can only do 1.5 mil, okay? Which is a 25% reduction, simple math, over our capital outlay funds at the local level. Since that time, in 2010, our district right here has lost the opportunity to fund $110 million worth of capital outlay projects. That's 3 Ks right there. We could address a lot of growth issues with that. Or one high school, one major high school, depending on which type of school you're building. Impact fees. So, we have impact fees here in the county. I get calls from time to time of people calling and complaining about, I don't have any kids, I'm buying a house, why am I paying an impact fee? We hear that a lot, but that is not something that we actually have the ability to do. We have to go through our county to get that done. We're in the process of doing that right now. We had a new study done to determine what our fee was. We talked to them about it. They're getting ready to vote on it. If you have an opportunity to speak to the county commissioner, please make sure you ask them to vote for that impact fee renewal because our district definitely needs it. It's based on the cost of the impact of the new residents. So every time you build a house, obviously there is an average of a student that's going to attend school based on that new home. So we're allowed to charge them a fee for that. And then the sales tax, which is used for remodeling projects approved by the referendum. We've had that here for a number of years. There's 2 sales taxes that you can participate in. We participated in one of the earlier ones where the county actually does a full 1-cent sales tax. And our county agreed to share 1/3 with us, 1/3 with the cities, and 1/3 for the county. And that just got renewed a few years ago. So we've got about another 18, 20 years of that. Okay, but some other counties actually have a 1/2 cent just for education. But the difference between 3% to 1/2% is not significant. It helped, I like it, but if we're already in one, we can't jump out and get into another. I don't think the voters would approve that. And besides, that is something that requires a voter referendum. It has to be voted on by the voters to be approved. So we've talked a little bit about Florida Lottery, and I made a couple of nice comments about how wonderful it has been for funding education. So what does the Florida Lottery program look like over a number of years? And again, 2003, you can see the red and the orange were K-12. The red was the operational, and the K-12 was debt service. So they were funding some debt service on some construction and stuff. 2003 for K-12. Division of Universities, Florida colleges made up about 25%. Florida Bright Futures a little bit less than 25%, but we were over half the funding of Florida Lottery back in 2003. So 2020, fast forward, and you'll see that we are now being pushed out again. We're here. We're probably a little over 35–40% of the funding. And what's happened is this last year, they've expanded Bright Futures, and that expansion of Bright Futures was almost, not quite, but almost a dollar for dollar reduction in K-12 education. So you can see what's happened. Now, the purple up there, workforce development, those funds flow through our school district. But the thing about the workforce, that's adult education, we're not allowed to spend any of that money on any normal K-12 student. It's for students outside of K-12. So, you know, they've added it there, but then again, it doesn't help us out from our day-to-day operation of K-12. But you can see Florida Bright Futures, which is a great program, by the way. Don't disagree with the program. I just don't like the funding being taken out of K-12 education to go fund that. They should have brought it from somewhere else. So Florida K-12 lottery, this is the actual money flowing to the schools. And just to kind of give you an idea of what's happening, $347.8 million, which is the red, goes into our FEFP. The orange is the class size reduction, 103.8 class size reduction. The district lottery and school recognition programs, 134, that's the yellow. The blue, the sliver, and the purple are all debt service programs related to the Class Size Reduction Act. So you can see the implementation of the Class Size Reduction Act and its impact on capital outlay. The state has put a lot of money out of the lottery into the debt service of those programs. Since 2002, the citizens passed a class size amendment. Since the approval of the class size amendment, legislators have appropriated $43.4 billion in operating expenses related to compliance of class size amendment. Between 2003 and 2008, Florida issued bonds in order to appropriate $2.5 billion for school facilities in order to address class size requirements. Since that time, they haven't done any more funding or appropriating new money for schools. So this is part in the presentation when I'm doing it in the community that I start getting more a little bit about, you know, what can we do as people in the community, you know, reach out and do this. And I start out with the Florida Constitution, and of course I always highlight the paramount duty of the state to make adequate provisions for education for all children residing in this border. So, and you know, it talks about adequate provision made for uniform, efficient, safe, secure, and that's language that really develops the FEFP to address the Florida Constitution. And then I talk about, well, what's happened, you know, it talks about that in the Constitution, it says education of children is a fundamental value of the people of the state of Florida. How much is it a fundamental value of the people of the state of Florida? Well, they're putting their money where their mouth is. The citizens in the state of Florida at 21 school districts have voted to tax themselves to increase a type of funding for education. When they do that, obviously they're committed to education in their communities, obviously. 26 districts have voter-approved referendums allowing them to add additional sales tax rates. The thing about sales tax rate is if you have a high tourism population, it's great because someone else is paying for your schools and not you. But yeah, that's beside the point. During the 2018 election, 15 school tax referendums went up for vote and 100% received approval. Every one of them that went up there in 2008, including ours, was approved. Currently, 7 school districts have both a voter-approved millage for operation and voter-approved sales tax for capital improvements. We're one of those 7. Our sales tax is done by the county, but we still count that as sales tax for our schools. And actually, one of those 7, Monroe County actually has 2 operational voter millages. They're separate. One's for security, one's for general operations. So this is where I say, what else can you do? Contact your state representative, your senator, your governor, speaker of the house. Timing, I talk about timing, you know. and that's important. The Commissioner of Education just released his budget. It's going to go to the governor now. The governor will roll that in with all of his other budgetary needs, and he'll submit that to the legislators. So it's good to call the governor now and say education is important to your student or to your student, your child, whatever, however you want to say it. And then also September through December, legislative committees will start meeting. They'll start talking about these needs. A lot of these decisions are going to be talked about. A lot of what hits the table for discussion in the regular legislative session has already been talked about and discussed prior to then. So it's a good time between those September to December to contact those legislators and tell them the importance of funding education in the state of Florida. And remember, this year is one of the years where we start early at the legislative session. So it will start in January and go through March. But I also like to warn people that it's really not a good time to try to contact your representative because they are extremely busy. It's hard to get to them. You may get one of their aides, which is sometimes better. So that is my presentation that I do to the community and anybody else who will listen to me. I did have the privilege of going to Mr. Cruz. I'm sorry, thank you. McHugh's school. It was right after school stopped, or right before school stopped. There was some teachers there. There was some other employees there, and there were a few community members there. And I was proud to have all of them there. Very good questions, very good insight, and I hope to continue to be able to do this across the district.